Hey everybody, it's Lon.TV, and I've got an update for you on those Apple replacement device lawsuit checks I talked about last week. As I mentioned, my check was incorrect. It was made out to the wrong name, and I heard from many of you who also had similar issues. And there was also some issues related to the fact that those of us in the class never got notified. Well, guess what? I actually heard from one of the attorneys in the case, and I've got them on the record, so we're going to hear what they have to say in response to some of the issues that were brought up in the last video. So let's get to it. Now, just in case you missed my last video, these checks that went out are not a scam. They're actually a settlement from a class action lawsuit that was brought against Apple. And in the lawsuit, the plaintiffs claim that when they sent in their device to Apple for an Apple Care replacement, the replacement device they received was refurbished or used or below the level of quality that Apple had promised in the terms and conditions. And so they formed a class action, and anyone who had an Apple Care replacement in the period of time that this lawsuit covers is entitled to a portion of the settlement. Now, the lawyers who brought this case, of course, walked away with $26.8 million, and the rest of us got about $14 and change per incident during the time that this lawsuit covers. So the lawyers did pretty well. We didn't do very well at all, and as I mentioned in the original video, the check that was made out to me had the wrong name on it. I can't even cash it yet. And a lot of folks like myself also did not get notified ahead of time that we were part of this class, and we lost our opportunity to opt out of the case, and now we're all forbidden from suing Apple over this issue ever again. Now, as I mentioned in the last video, I did reach out to the attorneys that brought the lawsuit against Apple, along with the claims administrator and the court that handled the case, and nobody had gotten back to me by the time I published that video. Now that the video is a top search result on Google and on YouTube, then I started getting some responses here, and I did have a pretty extensive back and forth with Michelle Crass, who's one of the attorneys that handled the case for the plaintiffs, the ones that brought the lawsuit and made all the money. And that firm that she works for is Hagens Berman, who is the firm of record for the class. Now, she did not want to appear on camera. She said she didn't have time to do it, but she did have enough time to respond to me via email and has been going back and forth with me for the better part of the week on some of the questions that I've been raising. And although you may not like lawyers, I do appreciate the fact that she was very upfront and open about what went on in the case here. Now, my chief concern that I had was the fact that they relied on email to notify members of the class. And the reason why notification is important is because you have the right to opt out of the class. And if you don't opt out of the class, you're often restricted from bringing a similar lawsuit yourself against the company that this class action is suing. So in this case, if you are part of this class and did not opt out, you can't sue Apple if they gave you a bum replacement during the period of time that this lawsuit covers. You're completely restricted from doing so. You'll get your $14 in the mail, and that is it. So why did they use email versus the U.S. Postal Service? Well, I think the answer to that question is obvious. Email's a lot less expensive, but it's also a lot less reliable. Now, I did ask Attorney Crass about the email method of delivery. She says the main method was email, obviously, which was approved by the court. She says, additionally, the emails were delivered, although that delivery number comes from the service they use to send out the emails. There's no way to know how many people actually got it in their inboxes, which you would have a better indicator of if you sent things out via the U.S. Postal Service. She says, we have no control who opens those emails after they are sent out or whether they claim their funds. She adds that the notice complied with Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 23, which requires the best notice that is practicable under the circumstances. And I did look up the rules of civil procedure, and sure enough, that language is in there, and the court did approve it. The court could have ordered them to use the U.S. Postal Service instead, which would be more reliable, but they argued in court email was the way they wanted to do it. Nobody objected, and the court went with it. And unfortunately, the court, I think, did not look out for the consumer's best interests when they allowed the email versus the U.S. mail for the notification. And as Attorney Crass and I went back and forth on this, it looks like there was definitely some deliverability issues. She said our initial distribution started back in August of 2022. She said the original payment distribution method was email, just like the notice. She said we sent emails to 2.8 million class members so they could claim their digital payment. either ECF or digital MasterCard. She said each class member received 4 emails, a prepayment email, a payment email, and 2 reminders. Both reminders were sent with the intention of increasing the claims rate. Despite those efforts, many of those digital payments went unclaimed. And I would argue it wasn't that people didn't want to claim them, it was that they never knew that they were eligible to get one in the first place because they never got the email. Whether it went into spam or never got to them, who knows? But the fact is they had a really hard time getting people to digitally claim these funds. So they had to go a step further. So what she said next here is that jointly with Apple, they requested that the deadline to claiming cash payments be extended to February 26th of 2023, and that was for the digital payments. The parties then agreed to send additional checks out to the 1.6 million class members that they had mailing addresses for, and that is what many of us got in the mail the other day. But of course, the names are incorrect on many of these checks. And I heard from a bunch of people when I made the first video. I've heard from a lot more since, both on YouTube and through the Reddit post that I made. So it's clear they've got a bunch of errors out there, at least from the small number of people that I've heard from. But I'm willing to bet there's a lot more out there if we're hearing from this many just from these Google searches. She did say that we are aware that a small portion of the 1.6 million checks have misspelled or incorrect names. She did not give me a total percentage of that, though. She can tell me that Epic, which is the claims administrator, has confirmed that it has not made any mistakes with the class member data, although there's no way to verify that. And she said those records that Epic is using to mail to us, in other words, the customer records, were never provided to her law firm. So everything went from Apple, allegedly, directly to Epic, who is handling the data and the check distribution for the case. Now, the only remedy they were offering initially to get these checks fixed was to, ironically, send them a letter via the U.S. Postal Service. And what they wanted on that letter was your name, address, email address, and the check number on the check that you received, and they would reissue you a check. The problem is that you had to mail it in, first of all, but secondly, that the payments were only going to be valid until May 30th, so a very limited window in order to complete this whole transaction. So she did offer an alternative, an electronic alternative in her communication with me. So she said if anyone got a check that was incorrect, you can email them at applecare@hbsslaw.com and provide them with that information, and they will get you a new check issued. So we did score a little victory here where you can just email them and get the right check sent back to you versus having to go through the mail. So I think that's a win. Now, a lot of you were wondering, and I was too, that if they got your name wrong and we never got the email notification that said we were part of the class, are we actually in this class? Do we have the right still to sue Apple if we wanted to over a bum AppleCare replacement? Well, to that question, Attorney Crass says, no, you're part of the class even if they got your information wrong. She says, if an individual received a replacement device with non-new parts in it, according to Apple's records, during the class period, they are part of the class. Now, I suppose you could bring your lawsuit against Apple. They would likely argue that because you received a phone with the used parts in it during that period of time, that you are part of the class because you didn't opt out of it. So it would probably cost you more to test that than it would probably to buy a new iPhone at this point. And along those lines of a consumer suing Apple individually, Attorney Crass says this is why she thinks these class action suits are effective for consumers. She says that they're a good mechanism for bringing about these types of claims because no consumer could afford to bring an individual claim against Apple for a claim of this size. And while I would agree that an individual consumer would have a very hard time arguing $95 million worth of damages for a bad phone that they got as a result of a warranty replacement, I think that consumer would have a great case in small claims court for $1,200 or whatever the value of that phone was. And this statement set off a light bulb in my head, which is why are consumers not taking these companies to small claims court? I bet you if Apple was getting hit with dozens of these small claims cases all the time, they would probably change their behavior quite a bit. And I can tell you that if I took Apple to small claims court for $1,200 for a bad replacement iPhone, I'd probably win if my case was strong, which it likely would be. And it wouldn't cost all that much to bring the case. It's usually just a small filing fee and that's it. And if you win, they end up having to pay that filing fee on top of some other damages that you could claim insofar as your time lost and all that kind of stuff. And it's certainly going to be a lot more than what you'll get from a class action suit. So the idea I'm having here, because I'm not a lawyer, is I would love to maybe set up a secondary YouTube channel where we do some real consumer advocacy, where we try to get something resolved with the company by shining a light on a particular consumer's issue, something very similar to what you might see on your local TV news with their consumer reporters. But if we're not able to come up with a solution there, then we consult with an attorney and we take them to small claims court. In the case of Apple, you're within your rights to sue them over something like this because Apple has a physical nexus in my state here of Connecticut. They have stores, they operate a business here, and so they are eligible essentially to be sued if they wrong their customers. And I think ultimately customers will do a lot better opting out of these class action lawsuits and bringing their own suit in small claims court, where they'll likely do much better than what we're seeing with these claims. And ultimately, as we saw from this back and forth with the attorney, these law firms are not putting a lot of effort into making sure every consumer gets their money. They got their money and they're just trying to get this thing over with so they can move on to the next case, and it's not serving consumers very well. And on the topic of money, I did ask her what happens with the money that isn't claimed. And what she says here is that they could do a second distribution to the class members who did claim their funds. So there might be some incentive at this point to cash that check. Maybe you'll end up with a lot more on the second go around. She said it could also get donated to a charitable organization if the court decides to go in that direction. But she did say the remaining funds don't go back to Apple and they don't go to her law firms. Everybody's made the money they're going to make here. And so that is what will happen, at least according to the attorney, if the money is not claimed. Now, has this lawsuit resulted in Apple treating customers better? The answer is no. They just changed their terms of service. So if we go in and look at what Apple Care's terms of service said before the lawsuit, Apple promised that they would repair the defect at no charge using new parts or parts that are equivalent to new in performance and reliability. And the same language was used if they did a replacement. Now the language says, after the lawsuit was filed, that they will again repair the defect at no charge using new parts or previously used genuine Apple parts that have been tested and passed Apple's functional requirements. So they actually stopped telling you that this would be as good as new and just said we will use used parts at our discretion. So they're still using used parts. Nothing has changed here other than they changed their terms of service now so that they can prevent a lawsuit in the future on similar grounds. So nothing changed from the consumer standpoint, but you do have $14 and change, and hopefully your check has the right name on it. And there's other examples of this, like the big Equifax data breach settlement, where Equifax totally lost control over credit data from a good number of American citizens here. There was a huge lawsuit. The lawyers collected $77 million and change, and I ended up with a whopping $17.61. So my advice here is that when you get one of these notices, if you get one, opt out and take them to small claims court. And if you're an attorney that wants to help me in this project, email me. Let's get this started, and we're going to start doing something right for consumers where people get what they deserve and companies will improve their practices. That's going to do it for now. Until next time, this is Lon.TV. Thanks for watching.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold level supporters Brian Parker, Chris Allegretta, Hot Sauce and Video Games, Logic KGR, Tom Albrecht, and Amda Brown. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to lon.tv/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit Lon.TV/S.